Yesterday, Sport Ireland announced that the IABA, governing Irish amateur boxing, would see 15% of its core funding stripped after, at an EGM this past weekend, they failed to adopt governance reforms that were set forth by Sport Ireland and indeed by the IABA's own governance review published earlier this year. To look at what could possibly happen next with the IABA, we're joined on the line by Story boxing journalist Sean McGoldrick. Sean, you're very welcome to the show.
Good evening, Richie.
You were in Roscommon at the weekend for this EGM. It was a big turnout. I think you mentioned of 135 clubs. 101 were represented on Sunday at this EGM. What was the mood heading into this? Because this EGM, I guess, had been a bit of a while in coming.
Yes, the mood was, how should we describe it, very defiant, Richie. Delegates had a lot of, and just to clarify, these were representing clubs because of the structure of the IABA. They were in a defiant mood. I think it was a kind of it was almost a referendum on the IABA leadership, and it was fairly clear. Well, actually, it was clear before the meeting that there was absolutely no way that the motion, the specific motion about the reform package would get the 85% vote, or would get that kind of a vote, 75% actually, which was needed to see it over the line. Like it's an extremely high threshold at the best of times. So the mood was basically defiant, and that was reflected in the speeches. I think there was about maybe 10 speakers, and I think only one backed the proposal, so you could see where it was going from an early stage, despite all the chairman of the board of directors, Kieran Kerwin, made an address. The chief executive, Fergal Carruth, also spoke, and Paul McDermott from Sport Ireland also addressed the delegates, and all three made it clear what the consequences were if they didn't vote yes, but it was obvious. At this stage, they weren't going to heed anybody's advice, and I think the minister's intervention earlier backfired totally. Now, I don't think there was much prospect of it ever being passed with that kind of a high threshold. But whatever slight chance of it getting any kind of a respectable vote, it disappeared pretty quickly when the minister made his intervention. And basically, I mean, the message was clear that. Just making financial threats against the clubs particularly wasn't going to wash. And you have to understand, or listeners have to understand, that the reason for this is that clubs don't get very little of the funds that are the government funding. Like the vast majority of the funding goes towards the high performance and basically paying the wages of the various staff. Now, there are various communities. I was just looking at the financial statement of the last year before you came on air there. There are various community schemes, particularly in Dublin. There's a Dublin City Council programme, and there's also a DCC Healthy Lifestyle programme, and various, also a community employment scheme. And it's not clear, actually, it's not clear whether they're going to be affected, at least in the short term. But the point is that, as the delegates repeatedly said, like, for the minister to make, these warnings about the financial cuts, well, they said we don't get any money anyway directly, so it doesn't affect us. So that was the kind of a mood. It wasn't really about the motions, about the reform. It was just about where the state of relations are between a sizable proportion of volunteers, coaches, county board officers, provincial board officers, and even members of the board of directors, between them and the higher echelons of management within the organisation. I mean, it has been totally fractured particularly in the last year, and that was a reflection of the mood in the meeting reflected that.
When the Minister, Jack Chambers, and when Sport Ireland talk about governance reforms, and they want to see adequate governance reforms, there was a governance review essentially, which was kind of set forward. The chairman of the IABA requested an independent review of the governance model of the IABA to be carried out. That was published earlier this year. And within that review, there were 64 different recommendations for governance review, and they covered different elements as regards kind of governance structures themselves, grassroots, culture and behaviour, etc., etc., etc. There's an awful lot to go through. What were the sticking points as regards those reforms from the point of view of the delegates on Sunday, and why were they so strongly taking away the Jack Chambers element? Why are they so strongly against these reforms, and how can this, I guess, impasse be broken?
All right, you'll have to forgive me. It's a bit like the Northern Ireland Protocol. If you thought it was complicated, you should try understanding this. This has a long history, and this is the real problem. In that originally the IABA was an amateur organisation, and it existed. It was founded in 1911, and up until the turn of this century, it basically had a staff of one. So after the Sydney Games in 2000, there was a report commissioned by the Sports Council of Ireland, as they were called then, into Ireland's performance, and this report identified or suggested the creation of high-performance programmes in various sports, and obviously because of Ireland's tradition in boxing, boxing was one of the sports prioritised, and Gary Keegan set about setting up a high-performance programme. But the government decided that, if they were going to be pouring a lot of money into boxing and other sports, they would need what they would call proper governance structure. So there was another report commission called the Genesis Report, and it suggested the creation of basically a board of directors to oversee all this, and this is actually where the problem started. So in 2008, there was an EGM. I wasn't really covering boxing at the time, but it was quite controversial. But by, I think, margin of 4 votes, this proposal was passed, which led to the creation of a board of directors. Now, that has been a thorny subject ever since, so much so that in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 vote, there was a High Court case taken by the Dublin County Board, which would be the biggest in the country, against the decision. Now, the case was eventually thrown out, and just to make matters worse, the 31 members who took the case got stung with legal costs of something like over 60,000, which was a lot of money at the time, and they had to fundraise and pay off that. So that left a very sour taste at the start, and quite honestly, that has never, ever been resolved. But the real problem at the moment is it hasn't a huge amount got to do with the report, because most people on the two sides of the divide would agree that there is reform needed. But it's just that there has been a complete breakdown of relationship between, as I said earlier, between the volunteers, the coaches, and the higher echelons. And just to give you one example, and this has caused, this probably meant that the reform package never had any chance of being voted through. There was a long-standing row, which has been going on for 2 years, actually since 2019, about the composition of the existing board of directors. And the members, i.e. the officials and the ordinary members, insist that in 2019, at an AGM in Belmullet, it was decided that there be 2 new directors added, but that the board of directors, for whatever reason, didn't implement this. Now, there was a minority of members of the board of directors who wanted to go ahead and appoint these, but it didn't go ahead for whatever reason. And this row festered for a long time, to a point where eventually the Leinster Council at a meeting passed a motion to withdraw support from the IABA Central Council in protest against this, against the fact that, as they see that the Central Council wasn't making enough noise to the Board of Management about these 2 new directors being appointed. And the Dublin County Board and the Connacht Council also supported that. And then just to explain, I mean, the structure of the IABA is very convoluted at the best of times. So you have a board of directors who, when they were formed, were initially seen to look after basically the financial end of it and the overall. And then you have the Central Council, or the Boxing Council, who were supposed to, or who are charged with the day-to-day running organising the various championships, etc., etc. But over the years, there are kind of roles of, well, they're not quite defined, and as the members of the Central Council would see it, the board of directors have encroached on their territory. But that's a slightly separate issue. The specific issue was that the Central Council, as it was then constituted, proposed that 25 people be banned basically for life, which was an extraordinarily punitive, action to take because they withdrew their support from them, and the board of directors sent this to. Well, at the outset, it looked like it was a disciplinary issue, but the board of directors decided it was a membership issue, so it was sent to a membership subcommittee who basically rubber stamped the decision. So there was 25 members, long-standing, like people who had been there for 50 years, including a man who was in his 80s, Paddy Keogh, who's a legendary figure in boxing in Dublin. They were all, basically banned for life. So they took a case to an arbitration body, and they won their case. And now it dragged on for quite a while, but the decision was announced in March. But there was a significant sting in the tail in that they ended up paying their own legal costs, which basically amounted to €2,000 each. So as you can imagine, that has caused a lot of friction and bad feelings. So it was against this background that I always felt that there was absolutely no chance that the reform package at the moment would go through. So it hasn't. It's difficult to explain it, but it hasn't really got. The vote on Sunday was not so much a reflection on what was in the package, but it was more on the general dissatisfaction. And this was the chance of the clubs to vent their anger. So we're left. Unfortunately, the end result of that is we're left with a big standoff between the various parties.
Yeah, it seems like a bizarre platform. I know it's the biggest platform they have to make that kind of a statement, but similarly, it's going to hurt the sport in the country and eat into the funding, as you mentioned. And Una May from Sport Ireland yesterday has already promised that there'll be further sanctions unless the reforms are adequately tackled, I guess, within the next couple of months. But there doesn't seem to be. I was listening to Jerry O'Mahony yesterday, the newly elected president. He obviously got elected on Sunday too. He was speaking to WLR, and he said that essentially the reforms haven't been rejected. In his view, they just needed tweaking. Have they given any kind of guidance as to what kind of tweaks are needed, or is it just a case that Sport Ireland, Jack Chambers, and whoever wants to represent the IABA need to sit down in a room and thrash this thing out sensibly and like adults? Because this kind of finger pointing, sanction upon sanction, doesn't seem like it's going to have any great impact or any. I don't think anybody's going to have their aims met by this kind of tactic from either side.
Oh yeah, I'll actually couldn't agree more. That's what I was going to suggest, that unless the parties, I mean, you're talking about there was one significant change at Sunday which probably hasn't been underreported, but and that included the election of Jerry O'Mahony. There was basically a new Central Council appointed. So the old Central Council had basically ceased to function. They had only one meeting this year, and they failed to raise a quorum at it. So it had basically become totally dysfunctional. So there's now a new Central Council in place. But basically, until the various parties get together in a room and probably under an independent arbitrator or negotiator and trash it out, the real difficulty is that it's hard to see whether where agreement could be reached while the current, and I'm not going to use names because it's not fair, people can't answer, until the leadership of the organisation, until there's a new regime, shall we say, and that presents huge difficulties. So there's no easy fixed solution. I mean, the other solution is Armageddon, is to dissolve. It has happened to other sports organisations to actually dissolve it, dissolve the IABA as it's currently constituted, and to set up a new organisation. Now, I would argue, having spent the last few years looking at this, that organisationally it's too convoluted. I don't understand why it has to be a limited company, for example, because that means that if you want to change the Articles of Association, you have to have a 75% backing. As anybody who's been involved in sports organisations know, that there's about 10% of all members against everything, regardless of what it is.
Yeah, look at Congress and in GA
exactly,
in terms of having to get Anton over the line there.
Yeah. But that's because, and they can't change that because it's a company. Like, I don't understand why it just couldn't be like the GA, which is a much bigger organisation, operate quite successfully. They have a separate company that looks after Crow Park, and that's fine. But the rest of it is just an organisation with a central council.
Sean, pardon me if you don't know the answer to this. What is the point in it being a limited company?
I don't know. That was part of the Genesis, I think, report, and that was the model that was adopted. But I think it's not fit for purpose, and it also creates this. Now, this is addressed, in fairness, in the review. It creates this problem that the board, nobody quite knows what the board of directors' functions are, and then what the central council functions are, and there's constant conflict
well, you can understand
between the two of them, and that doesn't even get into the role the high performance played. Like the high performance is answerable mostly to the board of directors, but it is for a relatively small organisation. Organisationally, it's in my book, it's all over the shop, to be honest.
Yeah, well, looking at some of the recommendations that were made, obviously, by this review earlier on in the year, it was that Central Council be reduced in size from the current 37, and that was an approximate number, 37 members down to 15, and the Board of Directors increased from 10 to 12, and the compositions of which would obviously change along the way as well. But 37 members of a Central Council for a boxing union in Ireland seems mad.
Yeah, well, it seems maybe 15, 20 some time ago, and it's suddenly, under the last president, apparently it increased to 35 for reasons that are not clear. The other issue I should say about the board of directors is that this is another bone of contention with members, is that it is proposed that 6 members of the board of directors would be appointed by an outside body. Now, the boxing fraternity, for want of a better word, have reservations about this, because one of their complaints is that since 2008, they have gradually lost control of their sport, and that people who have been appointed, shall we say, are not what they would consider boxing people. Now, that's probably an unfair accusation, but they want to know, like, who's going to appoint. Is it an independent body, or is it a single individual, or who exactly is A, going to appoint the chairman, and B, who's going to appoint the new directors, and also a clear definition of what precisely their role is. So that is a stumbling block, and that was the actual motion that was thrown out on Sunday. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, and that doesn't take into account the fact that there's a lot of ill-feeling, personality clashes, or call it what the lot, has been built up over the past decade. And one of the things, when I was writing the piece on Sunday, one of the things I wrote about was the fact that boxing officials tend to be what I call lifers. I mean, the same people that when I got involved in the sport years ago, they're still around. I mean, nobody can fault them. They're fantastic volunteers, but it's probably, they don't have, for instance, that rule, the GA rule, like, where you go after 5 years, or you at least change position. So there's a lot of people who were involved, say, pre-2008, are still involved. Now, there are new people. But the volunteers would argue that there'd be no boxing only for them. I mean, they do the work, on 7 nights a week or whatever in the clubs, and they resent the fact that, as they feel that they have been pushed out of the organisation at the highest level, and so it's a cultural thing as much as anything else. I mean, as I said, it's extremely intricate, and it's extremely difficult to see a way through as to how everybody can be satisfied. But I was thinking about it. Eddie Hearn, I don't mean to be flippant. Eddie Hearn, basically the driving force behind Matchroom, and who manages Katie Taylor, has a famous say that in boxing, if you throw enough money at any problem, it will sort it out. Now, I'm not saying that any amount of money would sort out this, but I think if the clubs ultimately are to be brought around, the government or the Minister for Sport or whoever will have to put a package of measures together and, to finance, to basically directly aid the clubs. Because I was just looking, I was looking it up last week, in the last Capitals, which is basically the capital grants, that the sports capital grants that go to sports bodies. In the 2020 announcement, which I think might have been for maybe 2018 or 2019 because of COVID, it might have been delayed. But anyway, there was 143.8 million distributed all throughout, in the 26 counties, obviously only, to various sports projects. And I think there was about 15 boxing projects got a princely sum of 360,000. So you can see that despite the success of boxing as an Olympic sport and world championships, etc., and despite the social value of boxing, which everybody agrees is invaluable to Irish society because it looks after the underprivileged and lots of places where other sports would never have any reach, it is, in my view, hopelessly underfunded by the government. So, and it's not, the government are coming down heavy on the IABA, and maybe they're right, but they have some questions to answer themselves. And the other issue which I would have with both Sport Ireland and the Minister is that this problem hasn't developed overnight, and particularly in the last 12 months. I was tired sending them emails pointing out the various issues that had arisen. Like, one of the most contentious was, as a result of that, what I mentioned earlier about those 23 members being banned, the underage championships, like juvenile championships, this is young kids now, in probably their first championship. There was 50 kids from Leinster not allowed to compete in the Leinster Championship last year. And basically the Minister and Sport Ireland stood idly by and allowed that to happen. I mean, instead of calling the parties in and saying, listen, lads, whatever about your differences at boardroom level, there's no way that kids should be deprived of competing in a championship.
Yeah.
So you can see why
it's a mess, Sean. Basically, it's a mess. Do you know what? I've come out of this piece, and it wasn't my intention. Probably with more questions about the IABA that probably need to be untangled. And I'll take, it'll take a series to get this thing unpicked. So God knows what Una May and Jack Chambers and the heads of the IABA are going to do over the next while. I have a feeling we'll be talking to you again soon about this, though, Sean. So stick by your phone. Sean McGoldrick from the Sunday World. Thank you so much.